Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Willis Centre on this lovely, balmy autumnal night. Thank you for coming here. And we're going to be discussing Australian literature in all its guises. But before we begin in earnest, I just want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to elders of other communities who may be with us tonight. My name is Thuy On. I'm a freelance literary critic and books editor of The Big Issue. And with me are two recent winners of the Prime Minister's Literary Awards in their respective fields. We have Ryan O'Neill, who won for their brilliant careers in the fiction category. And we also have Elizabeth Tynan, who won for the Merolinga story, Atomic Thunder. But before we begin, I just want to mention also that we are missing one person who should be on the website, Kath Crowley, who is actually quite ill and can't make it tonight, so apologies on her behalf. She won for the YA prize, Words in Deep Blue. And also, these two are going to hang around and sign, so please buy a copy of their books from Robertson's bookstore at the back there towards the end of the session. This is an hour session. There will be 15 minutes towards the end for QA. So please, if you have any queries, just leave them towards the end. I'm going to begin with you, Ryan. Okay, so Ryan O'Neill is the author of The Weight of a Human Heart and Their Brilliant Careers. He was born in Glasgow and has lived in Africa, Europe and Asia before settling in Newcastle with his wife and two daughters. Now, this winning book, which I'm going to show the cover again, Their Brilliant Careers is obviously a cheeky nod to Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career. And for those in the audience who has not read this, I recommend that you do. It's very funny, most of it. It's also quite poignant and moving, but it's quite satirical, and it features a series of 16 linked biographical portraits of fictional Australian authors across the gamut of categories. So Ryan features plagiarists and poets and bestsellers and hacks and avant-gardists. He had a lot of fun playing around with what was out there. It's very hard to describe this book. You have to read it yourself because it's a mix of fact and fiction and pure imagination and an amalgamation of various men and women of letters. And in some stages, he also integrates fictional characters with real-life historical literary moments. And it's a bit of a guessing game, I guess like an alternate universe of Auslit, like a who's who. And you read it and you try and work out what exactly he's trying to do and who he's trying to sort of make into a caricature. And so it's a very sort of a fun and quite intellectually demanding read, this one. You don't just read it, you know, you have to actually think about this book. And it's a wonderful winner. Sorry for the very long prelude, but Ryan, tell me about your research into this book, because it was so much fun reading it, and I think, was it much fun to research it?
Yeah, the research for the book was kind of accidental in that a few years ago I did a PhD, a doctorate, in creative writing, and it involved reading a lot of Australian fiction. Before I came to Australia, I'm ashamed to admit that I literally hadn't read a word of Australian fiction. My cultural experience with Australia was limited to Neighbours and Home and Away, which are fantastic. And it was always my ambition to own a ute, that great word ute, and I now do own a ute, which is great. So I came to Australia, it was very much a blank slate for me in terms of fiction. So I started obviously to read a lot of primarily short fiction because I'm a short story writer and I love short fiction. I discovered a whole host of amazing writers that deserve to be better known abroad. And then later did, as I said, a PhD in creative writing, which involved a lot of reading. So I read a lot of stories, and so it wasn't in preparation for Their Brilliant Careers. It was only about 3 years after I'd finished it when I had the idea to write it, that all that reading had kind of been mulching in my subconscious, and it was all there to draw on when I actually wrote the book.
And sort of, I know this is a very broad question, so what can you tell us about your research into this sort of collective history of Australian authors then and now? Because it goes back several hundred years, you know, I mean, it's past and present. I can't remember the spanning the years, but what can you tell us about what have you learnt, the progression or the devolution maybe of what you've sort of researched and written about?
Well, the book goes from, I think it stretches through the lives of 16 writers. I think it stretches from roughly the mid-19th century right the way through to 2016, with the death of my fictional late wife, who is a character in the book. It's dedicated to her, but she doesn't actually exist. And
there are in-jokes throughout the entire book.
Yeah.
Yes.
So even my previous publications are made up. The bio on the back of the book is made up, and the dedication to my late wife is made up. My wife is actually alive. She wasn't entirely happy that she'd been sidelined by a fictional ex-wife. And in fact, a friend in Scotland emailed me his commiserations when he thought that she'd actually died. So I should make that clear. So what did I learn about Australian literature? I learned that it's...
Just from an outsider point of view too,
Yeah.
Ryan, I think it's really fascinating because I think those of us who grew up in this culture, I think we take a lot for granted, but from an outsider's perspective, it would have been really interesting.
Yeah, I think I learned that there's sadly, as with any culture, there has been, and to an extent still is, sexism in Australian literature and Australian society, of course, and that was the focus of a couple of the lives in the book. And one of the fictional authors that I created for the book is a poet, Matilda Young, and throughout her life in the book you see her struggling with various forms of sexism, being dismissed, her poetry and her writing being dismissed because she's a woman. And then this culminates in the late 1940s, where Matilda Young's poetry is acclaimed abroad and she wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. But everyone in Australia just ignores it, except for one headline in a small newspaper which says, "Melbourne housewife wins writing competition."
Yeah.
And then she's forgotten until the 70s when Patrick White wins, and then she's like, "Wait a minute, I won this 30 years ago," and no one takes any notice. And that was that's pushing things, to absurdity. But that was kind of emblematic of some during my research, seeing some real Australian writers like Gwen Harwood and women like that who did struggle throughout their lives against sexism and being taken seriously and having their work taken seriously. They were dismissed for a lot of their lives. And I found that there is, perhaps because Australian literature, it can be a fairly small pond. It's not so much 6 degrees of separation as maybe 2 or even 1. Everyone seems to know each other. So it was fun to see there have been feuds, there have been hoaxes and things like that. So that was really interesting, the whole Ern Malley affair, which I didn't know about until I came here, where someone created two sort of more conservative poets created a modernist poet. And they submitted the poetry they'd invented, which they tried to make deliberately bad, but it was actually really good by accident. And this was then later published, and it caused a great scandal. Things like that I found fascinating. They found their way into the book. So I think perhaps, in my experience, some Australians, they look at Australian literature as a very dry subject. And in fact, I've met quite a few Australians who simply say, "I don't read Australian novels. I don't read them. I can't get into them." And I think that's a huge shame, because the book does take the mickey out of Australian literature, but I hope it's also a celebration of it as well. There is a very rich literary tradition. There's lots of great books out there to be discovered, I think, but in Australia and beyond.
Oh, completely. Your book sort of creates your own library list, really. You sort of read that and you want to go back and try and discover or rediscover some of these authors that you have sort of used and played with. Just getting back to Matilda Young, I was very struck by her story, because also she had to use a male pseudonym to get by, to get any sort of traction and credibility in her field, because she was not taken seriously. And also one of your other characters, Rand Washington, whose books were pulpy bestsellers and who was quite bombastic and quite racist. I just want to bring it into sort of modern 21st century publishing mores now, and I think, which is a great thing, we are far more diverse and far more colourblind in our Australian publishing culture after, 100 years or whatever. And I think that's an amazing thing. Like, we have trailblazers like people like Maxine Benedict Clark and Alice Pung, who are amazing women of colours and the Stella Prize, who have been working tirelessly to promote women in Australian literature, and not just the writers, but also to the critics. So we are, I think, making inroads into a more level playing ground when it comes to publishing diverse, multicultural text. And that's a great thing, because I think for years you'd just be forgiven for thinking that, the Australian culture of Australian literature is about this white guy in the bush. And it's so not that. Not now, not in the 21st century. We're so much more plural and so more diverse and so much more interesting than Australian past history would lead you to believe. Do you agree with that, Liz?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, the colonial influence as well, the white European male, that doesn't mean that it was only the white European males who were writing.
No, I know.
They were the ones who were
promoted.
being noticed, and Ryan has brought that out.
It's like a retrospective thing you've done, Ryan,
yeah.
which is wonderful. Just bring us to mirror that. Yes, we were like this, and now we're much better, and we're going along. I think the whole gender and sexual politics is finally coming to the fore, and it's finally being represented in all our literature across the field, and I think that's amazing. Just for something slightly different, I'm going to this is a very loosely based forum. I'm going to talk about short stories, because it's very rare for a short story collection to win a major prize, as this one has. And I also think for years and decades and centuries, you're not really a proper author until you've written a massive tome, And books such as yours, which has won this collection of stories. And also, I recently convened the Vic Premier's Lit Awards for fiction, and our winner was Melanie Cheng's Australia Day, which was a suite of short stories. And it was quite a controversial decision, because short stories don't normally win. And she was up against Sophie Laguna and Steve Carroll and all these people. But we felt that her stories represented modern Australia. And yours do too, in a different way. And so I think, for me personally, Australian literature is amazing, because he's finally incorporating stuff like short stories. He's finally being validated after being neglected for so long. Do you agree with that, Ryan?
Yes, definitely. And I mean, according to the book, was fortunate enough to be shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award last year. But the only reason it would have been on that shortlist was because what we called it a novel, and it is kind of a novel. You could call it a novel in stories. It has been called a short story collection. It's kind of a weird thing where you could read every individual.
It's very hard to describe this book.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, you could read every individual chapter on their own, but they all interlink, and there is an overarching plot. And I remember, I just remember an email exchange with my publisher before it came out, and we're talking about the blurb, and the blurb said it's a novel. I remember, is it a novel? And he said, yeah, okay, then it's a novel. And I'm very glad I did, because that's the only reason it would have been the only reason in the Miles Franklin is it's a novel.
There's no prizes, are there, for short story collections? Are there?
There's one. There's the Queensland Premier Steel Rudd Award. There's only one national award for a short story collection.
That.
Yeah,
that sounds really bad. Does anyone know if there's any others, or is that the only one in the national?
For a collection, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Wow.
Lots of short story competitions.
Yeah, short stories, but not a major national
not a collection.
One. Okay.
But it's certainly, I came to Australia in 2004, and back then it just seemed, I started submitting stuff, and it was really hard to get a collection published. It seemed there were very few getting published by Australian publishers. The occasional one, and usually it was a novelist who'd get a novel published, and then they'd get a collection published, but I think a couple of things changed that. One was the publication of Nam Leaves the Boat and the success of that. That really seemed to take a lot of people by surprise. Yeah. And also Kate Kennedy's first collection, Dark Roots. They were both sort of big hits and really well reviewed, won awards.
Maxine's Foreign Soil.
Yeah, later on, they were the early ones that built. So now we've got some, a lot of the big publishers are much more willing to publish collections than certainly they were before, when in the last 10 years. I think in the last 5 years, it's been a really big swing in the publishing of collections, which is fantastic.
And your previous book too, Ryan, was a collection of short stories as well.
Yes, it had been rejected by everyone.
Really?
Oh yes, it got rejected by everyone, so much so that I'd given up. And then,
sorry, why was it rejected? Can you just tell us some gossip?
The one...
Because I thought it was wonderful. How could
this was back... I was submitted in 2010, 2011, and I just remember... One rejection letter, it was a standard rejection, but they'd accidentally left a post-it note on there which just said, in a word, no.
Oh,
So that one did smart a little bit.
that's so cutting and so...
It was by mistake. Somebody meant to take it off before they did that. And then I'd given up, and Black Ink saw one of my stories in Best Australian Stories, and they said, "Have you got a collection?" And I was so pessimistic. I said, they asked me, "Have you got any books?" And I said, "Well, yes, I do, but it's only a short story collection. You're probably not interested." And then they said, yes, we are. And I was so sure it was going to get rejected, I didn't even bother proofreading them. I just literally cut and pasted 20 stories in a document, sent it off, and thought, I'm not going to waste my time, it'll get rejected. And they took on, which was fantastic. But no, that was 2010, 2011. It was still building. There's still not as many collections as being published today. I think it's really the last couple of years. There's many more collections coming out, and they're getting recognised in like the Fantastic Australia Day, as you mentioned, winning the Victoria Premier's Literary Award. So they're actually getting recognised as well. It's not just on the steel rud of that one award, it's actually other awards shortlists, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to bring Elizabeth Tynan into discussion now. She is a science writer and academic at the James Cook University, graduate research in Queensland. A former journalist, she completed a PhD on aspects of British nuclear testing in Australia, which brought along this book, and is co-author of the book Media and Journalism, New Approaches to Theory and Practice. Elizabeth, can you just talk to us a little bit about your sort of background to this book and how you sort of came about? This is an interesting topic to somehow just research. How did it just come about in your field of vision?
It does have a bit of a history, actually.
Okay,
A little bit of convoluted passage, I suppose. It has its deep beginnings in the fact that I was born in Adelaide, and my grandfather was one of Len Bedell's men, and Len Bedell surveyed the Maralinga and Woomera sites, and he was a legend in many ways, and Grandpa was one of his team. I didn't know that until actually relatively recently. But also both my parents worked at the ANU, and my father worked with Ernest Titterton, who features quite strongly in this book.
Sorry, can I just cut in? I haven't described this book yet for those in the audience who has not read it. Could you just give us a brief description of what Atomic Thunder is about, Liz?
Yes, certainly. It's subtitled The Maralinga Story, but it's actually more than Maralinga because the British tested 12 mushroom cloud bombs in Australia, as some of you might know, and 3 of them were tested at the Montebello Islands off the coast of Western Australia, and 2 were at Emu Field, which was even more remote in the South Australian desert than Maralinga. It was an episode of what we now know, I think, as nuclear colonialism. It was a colonial power appropriating land with actually very little resistance from the government of Australia at the time, led by Robert Menzies. So this is an account, and it's in many ways, I think, a fairly journalistic account, because my background is journalism, and there are many books about Maralinga, and there are some wonderful books about Maralinga, and there's some very, very well-written, fabulous books about Maralinga, but what I wanted was a book that everyone would be able to read and would appreciate what I consider to be secret history in many ways. It was secret. It was totally secret for a very, very long time. And for many people, it's a very perplexing matter, Maralinga. People don't really know. It was said to me at one of the book launches when the book first came out that the Maralinga story should be as well known to Australians as the Anzac story.
But it's so covered up that,
disagree.
Yeah. Can I just talk a little bit about accountability, Liz? Because you come from a journalist background, and obviously I think this book reveals that we cannot take politicians at face value, and there really needs to be public independent scrutiny. If anything else you get out of this book, it's that. Do not trust politicians, but we all know that. So it's confirmation anyway of that. I just want to ask this fairly general question. Do you think Australian authors, and particularly non-fiction authors in particular, do you think we're far more braver in trying to expose truth now? Or we've always been sort of rebellious?
The way I see it, and I perhaps have a narrow perspective because I'm particularly focused on the uncovering of information around the atomic tests, but I don't think we really had an investigative journalism culture here until the 70s. And that's part of the reason why Maralinga and the associated tests were so secret, because the journalists of the 50s in Australia were scientifically illiterate. They were not focused on this kind of technology because Australia was not a nuclear power itself, and there'd been no real pressure for Australian media to get a handle on it.
And you have that scientific background too, don't you, Liz? So that would feed into this research. You have that sort of hard, rational background.
Well, yes, no. I mean, my first degree was an arts degree and majoring in history and literature. So I read an awful lot of Australian literature and other kinds of literature as well. So I kind of see myself as someone who straddles the two cultures, because at a certain point, I'd been at the ABC for a while as a TV and radio journalist, and people started giving me science stories to do, and I was the only one who would do them because I found them really interesting in the newsroom. And bit by bit, I recognised that that's what I really wanted to do. Anyway, so I ended up a science journalist, and my first gig as a science journalist, really, I spent a year completely feeling like an idiot, like a complete idiot. I had no idea about the scientific concept. So fortunately, the scientists that I encountered were extremely kind and willing to treat me like an idiot 12-year-old and bring me up to speed. So, but yes, I mean, I did become a science journalist and I have a great interest in science. But I think having that earlier background in the arts and humanities and still feeling like I'm part of that world.
It's good to be straddling both worlds, though. They're not sort of mutually incompatible. You know, they are, arts and science can work together, as this book shows. I think you use both of those disciplines in this book.
Yeah, I think I did.
Yeah.
I think I did. I mean, my first love was writing, and that
knits everything together.
Yeah,
the writing.
It was well before my interest in science. I wanted to be a writer. I almost couldn't help but be a writer.
Can you just talk to us a bit about your journalistic background and the nexus between that and nonfiction in general? I mean, I think they're obviously bleeding. They both bleed towards each other, and it's very hard to sort of distinguish one from the other, really, isn't it? I mean, journalism and nonfiction in this book.
Yeah, I think so. Although there was some family pressure for me to become a doctor, that was never
That's
going
the
to
science
work.
background there, pushing it.
Yeah, but I was drawn very much to writing, and when I was 15, one of my friends, it was actually the boyfriend of one of my close friends, gave me a copy of 1984 by George Orwell, and it really changed my life. I also read Brave New World, Aldous Huxley at the same time. Those two books, I read them one after the other, and suddenly my whole world, the universe shifted on its axis for me. Everything changed, and I knew that this is what I had to do. Not that I'm putting myself in the same category, but what I'm saying is that it opened up some possibilities in my mind about what might be possible for me. So I ended up doing a professional writing degree. It was called Bachelor of Arts in Professional Writing. So that was the degree that I did. And at around about that same time, I started reading Clive James as well, who may be slightly problematic a figure these days, but back then, and we're talking quite a few years ago now, back then his journalism and particularly his television criticism really influenced my...
All of these influences come through in this book. As you're talking, I'm trying to sort of think of
no,
how that
there.
comes into this.
It's
Everything
there.
comes into this book, comes to the fore, yes.
I have, since I was 15, I have tried to emulate George Orwell's ability to write.
George Orwell, Clive James.
Yes, and many others as well.
Aldous Huxley for the scientific thing. There's like bits. Yeah, it's a bit like Ryan, because it's just like a hodgepodge of influences and ideas. So both these books are books of ideas. So I think you both wander so widely. It's sort of hard to even describe in a way, because this is more than just about these nuclear tests. I think you've just and I think it's like Australia's historical past and really why we should be far more suspicious.
Well, I worked at Parliament House for a while in Canberra, so that's why I developed
Can I just ask,
a
did you get any
suspicion.
sort of political I don't know, problems writing this book? Did you get anyone from up above going, what are you doing? This is all secret history. Don't bring it out into the open. Did you get in trouble?
It's funny how people often ask me that, but no, not at all.
Not at
No,
all?
none whatsoever. I've never
really
felt
good, yeah. Okay.
any pressure like that, largely because there was a Royal Commission in the mid-1980s on Maralinga, which incidentally did not reveal all the story by any means. However, it was a great opening up. And I think there was a sort of a political shift as well at that time that this should no longer be secret. Now, having said that, the British are still keeping things very secret.
Yeah, well, they
And
don't really come off very well in this book, so I can see why.
I've not long ago been at the National Archives in Kew in the UK for my next book, and it's frightening, really, and actually it makes me very angry when I see how many files pertinent to the British tests in Australia are still retained by the Ministry of Defence all these years later. So the British still are keeping something secret, but there's no sense of that in Australia these days.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly stop talking for a while because I want Ryan and Liz to read about a couple of pages from your work, just to whet everyone's appetite who haven't read these books. So, Ryan, do you want to just begin with reading a little short excerpt from Their Brilliant Careers?
Yes, as we mentioned, Their Brilliant Careers is a series of biographies. It's presented as non-fiction, but they're invented biographies of made-up Australian writers. So this is a little extract from the life of Frederick Stratford, who is Australia's most notorious plagiarist. So we pick up on Frederick's life. He's in his 20s and he's working for Customs and Excise. So this is in the early 20th century, 1918 it begins. During the Great War, he was excused from military duty due to his employment and was quickly promoted through the ranks until 1918, when he replaced his father as director of the Customs and Excise Office after Lawrence Stratford's retirement. In May 1922, Frederick Stratford began the second and most audacious period of his literary larceny, using his authority as director to order the seizure of all copies of James Joyce's recently published Ulysses that came into the country. Stratford burned every copy of the novel bar one, which he took home and retyped over the next 6 months, replacing references to Dublin with Sydney and removing vulgar language. In November, he submitted the retitled Odysseus to Allenby and Godwin. Lloyd Allenby found large parts of the novel incomprehensible, but was still able to recognise its tremendous skill and originality. After some hesitation, he accepted the novel, which was received with equal parts bafflement and acclaim when it was published in March 1923. Odysseus entered a second printing in April, the sales at least partly driven by the fact that it contained lewd passages that Stratford hadn't excised because he was ignorant of the sexual practices Joyce described. With the publication of Odysseus, Stratford became the darling of the Sydney literary scene, a position cemented by the critical and commercial success of A Journey to India, published little more than a year later. He came to the attention of the powerful when there was talk of him standing for Parliament. He attended parties and soirees held in the capital's grandest houses. Reporters hounded him. They demanded to know why he didn't retire from the customs service to write full-time. Stratford would reply that he wanted to serve his country as well as his art. In reality, retiring from the service was out of the question. His literary career depended on his being able to seize novels as they entered the country and destroying all but one copy, which he would then plagiarise. The books he published over the next few years exhausted the superlatives of Australian critics. The Enchanted Mountain, 1924. The Prodigious Gatsby and Mrs. Galloway, both 1925. The Sun Comes Up Too, 1926. And Hooroo to All That, 1929. One perceptive reviewer for the Western Star, noting Stratford's perfect control of an almost inconceivably varied range of styles and voices, commented, "It's as if Frederick Stratford were not one writer, but many." The recently published The Sun Comes Up Too had been proclaimed as another triumph, and Stratford's chances of being the first Australian to win the Nobel Prize in Literature were widely discussed. That same year, however, his deceptions showed signs of unravelling. Critics drew attention to examples of carelessness in Stratford's oeuvre. The sanatorium in The Enchanted Mountain was in Katoomba on one page and Davos in Switzerland in the next. And the Brisbane of Mrs. Galloway had not only a British museum but also a Piccadilly circus. Stratford's defenders pointed out that Shakespeare had clocks striking the hour in ancient Rome, which didn't make him any less of a genius. The most serious charge against Stratford came in an article published in August 1926, which set out the argument that Stratford had plagiarised James Joyce's Ulysses. Stratford angrily refuted the claim. And in May 1929, he issued a brazen statement in the Bulletin and announced his recent discovery that his work was being plagiarised by overseas writers. Retaining lawyers in the United States, France, Germany and Great Britain, Stratford launched lawsuits against Ian Foster, Virginia Woolf, Robert Graves, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Mann, F. Scott Fitzgerald and James Joyce for breach of copyright. The remainder of Stratford's life was taken up by protracted legal battles, as the authors he'd attacked launched countersuits against him. Hemingway sent Stratford a telegram in November 1930, threatening to come to Australia for the pleasure of punching him in the nose. Fitzgerald's response to the blizzards of suits and countersuits was to get blind drunk. After one long weekend of dissipation in July 1929, he started to believe that Stratford had indeed written The Great Gatsby, and he, Fitzgerald, was the plagiarist. Nathaniel West had to restrain Fitzgerald from throwing himself from a moving automobile. At first, Stratford's publishers and a host of Stratfordian critics united in their support for the beleaguered Australian prodigy, whose work had been cannibalised by foreigners. Yet it was not long before mountains of evidence proved beyond all doubt that Stratford was a liar and a cheat. His friends turned their backs on him. Allenby and Godwin, crippled by legal fees, recalled all of Stratford's books that they could and pulped them. The firm went bankrupt in February 1932. Lloyd Allenby killed himself a few weeks later. Stratford, unashamed and unrepentant, revelled in the notoriety the case brought him, making ever more outlandish claims about the writers he'd accused of copying him. Joyce's Dubliners, 1914, Stratford maintained, had been stolen from his Sydney home in a burglary in 1910. In interviews, Stratford continued to press his claims against Hemingway and the others, stating jocosely, "If I am not the authors of those books, why have I suffered from such terrible writer's cramp these last 10 years? Stratford did indeed suffer increasing pain in his right hand for the last decade of his life. In late 1932, he realised that this pain was due to a chondrosarcoma, a cancer originating in the fingers. The diagnosis came too late for treatment, and Frederick Stratford died on 19th January 1933, disgraced and shunned by his erstwhile supporters, but protesting his authorship of the disputed novels to the last."
Oh, thank you, Ryan. I love your book because it's so playful and it's very mischievous. So that was only one of about 16 stories in their brilliant careers. Now for you, Liz, can you just read a little bit from your book?
Oh, what a hard act to follow.
I know, I'm sorry, it's very hard because they're so different in tone.
They are, yes, so maybe not so many laughs out of this one.
All right, put your serious caps on now.
Okay, this is just part of chapter 1. Mid-May 1984, autumn, and the plains of Maralinga are cooling down after a hot summer. At the moment, it doesn't get much above 22 degrees Celsius during the day, unlike in summer when the daytime temperatures can exceed the mid-40s. At this time of year, it goes down to a chilly 5 degrees Celsius overnight. The Maralinga lands are to the north of the Nullarbor Plain, on the eastern edge of the Great Victoria Desert, Australia's largest desert. Maralinga is 850 kilometres from Adelaide and just north of the Indian Pacific train line that carries passengers and freight across the continent. Tietkens Well, dug by the English explorer William Henry Tietkens in 1879, is the earliest token of European presence. The landscape is mostly flat, with some gently sloping hills on the horizon and many sand dunes. Most of the terrain is capped by rugged travertine limestone, up to 3 metres thick in places, forming a rocky crust. Its top surface has been busy eroding over millennia into dust that swirls constantly and often whips up into fierce, blinding storms. The overwhelming colour of the landscape is red, broken by the olive green of the stunted, scrubby saltbush, the needle-leafed mulga, and the tussocky spinifex that dominate the vegetation. Bird life abounds. There are over 100 species in the area, including bellbirds, honeyeaters, bustards, kingfishers, and birdsong is one of the dominant sounds, other than the wind. The abandoned Maralinga Atomic Weapons Testing Range forms part of the western extremes of the much larger Woomera Prohibited Area, a chunk of South Australia that could accommodate England within its boundaries. The British used Woomera for even longer than Maralinga to test post-war rocket technology. The entire area was surveyed by the legendary Australian bushman Len Bedell, who lent an air of larrikin myth to this vast expanse of outback. He told rollicking tales of his surveying adventures during the mid-1950s, assessing the land for its usefulness for testing atomic weapons. The surveying project was top secret at the time, though Bedell later wrote about it in 2 popular books that told the story of his time in the bush. Bedell and his men liked what they saw at X300, as they dubbed the area, and reported back to Professor William Penny, the head of the British Nuclear Weapons Test Authority, that it would be perfect for the task. Penny visited to see for himself, spirited there secretly in October 1953, and was well pleased. "It's the cat's whiskers," he said. History would soon follow. When it did, this ancient landscape saw some remarkable sights. Hydrogen-filled balloons bobbing around in the bright sky, bristling with measuring gear. 55-tonne metal scaffolds called, inexplicably, feather beds, rising from the concrete pads to hold simulated nuclear warheads that glinted briefly in the sun before being blown sky high. A Royal Air Force Valiant aircraft releasing a bomb 10,000 metres in the sky, creating a mushroom cloud 150 metres above the plane, as men in summer issue military shorts turn their backs to its sun-like brightness. 52-tonne Centurion tanks and other military vehicles scattered around 7 major bomb sites. A village with a cinema, a swimming pool and single men's quarters made from prefabricated garages, eventually large enough to accommodate thousands of men. An airstrip that felt the weight of both military and civilian aircraft. A network of sealed roads covering 130 kilometres that made travel around the site fast and easy. Then, suddenly, the forces of history departed, and the site fell silent. But never again would it be pristine. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And that was Liz reading from Atomic Thunder. You know, Liz, as you're reading that, I was sort of thinking, it's so filmic. Has anyone approached you to do a documentary about this? Is it
I
in the
could tell
works?
you, but I have to kill you.
Oh, okay. All right. No one who can follow this up. But I take it that's a yes, but we can't get into it.
It's actually a maybe.
Oh, that's
There's
fantastic,
nothing
because it's so
definite yet.
filmic. The way you read it, I could just I can see all of these descriptions in my mind's eye.
I can too. I
Yeah.
can too. I think it's likely, but nothing's been made definite yet.
There's no
Yeah.
green light as yet. So it's
No.
pretty much on amber at the moment.
Yeah,
sort of?
yeah, ish.
Ish.
Yes.
All right, somewhere. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to bring this discussion to just the study of Australian literary canon, just because I know when I was studying at uni many, many moons ago, I studied European lit and American lit, but not Australian lit. And both of you are academics. Do you know, have things changed much? I mean, are there lots more sort of single courses of studying and celebrating Australian lit? Because we have to sort of celebrate our own culture. And sometimes I think there's still this cringe, you know, that we're not good enough.
Geordie Williamson, a critic and writer, wrote a book a couple of years ago called
Yes.
The Burning Library, where he wanted to, he felt that Australian literature had been undervalued, and he wrote, it's a great book, a book sort of talking about a lot of these undervalued writers like David Ireland and writers like that. And in that book, he did a survey of Australian universities, and there was some, it was a little bit controversial. He said that the study of Australian literature was definitely in decline, but then after the book came out, there was a little bit of pushback from Australian academics saying, no, it's not, there's this, this and this, but certainly, so I think, yeah, there's still a bit of debate about that. I would just personally say that whatever is available at the moment, I would say it's not enough. There should definitely be
Yes.
opportunities to study Australian literature. I think it's sad that I mean I'm certainly not. I could be much more widely read in Australian literature. I've still got a long way to go. I do find
I think
it odd.
you're more widely read than most people.
Well, that's what I
right?
find odd is that I'm a Scotsman who's been here for 13 years, and yet I think
it takes an outsider to be more widely read.
Possibly,
Yes.
because it is. I mean, I think, as I said, there is that tendency, perhaps, among some Australian readers to just dismiss it as being quite dry or just not really for them. Which I didn't. For me, it's strange. It's different countries, literature. So it's new. It's very different from Scotland.
Yes.
Scotland doesn't, and the preoccupations and themes are very different as well. So I found that fascinating. So whatever the current state is, I'm sure there must be room for improvement, and I think there is a danger it's true. A lot of writers are forgotten. I mean, just to give one example, we all know Henry Lawson, I'm sure, but there was one of his contemporaries, a female writer called Barbara Bainton. She only published one book of short stories, I think one novel. I mean, Lawson wrote over 200 stories, and arguably he wrote 5 or 10 classics. Barbara Bainton wrote 12 stories, and I would say each of them is a classic. But yet, Lawson is very much part of the national myth, the larrikin, the bush. Yes. Barbara Bainton, she really, in her short stories, she really examined the violence and the sexism behind that foundation myth, the pioneer myth, and perhaps that's why she is not as well known. But that's a writer who deserves to be on every syllabus going, and she's not. Sad. That's just one example of many of the Australian writers that are not being read, not being published, and are ripe for rediscovery.
There should be some sort of public campaign to raise awareness of all these lost, forgotten authors. And I think I asked the question because I'm sort of well-read, but not entirely well-read, but I'm better than most. But I just know that reading your book, maybe some of the young millennial readers will just go, it would completely lost on them. They would have no idea who you're trying to sort of characterise. It'll be completely new to them. They wouldn't have any idea that there are echoes and subversions and plays with real Australian authors, because they've never encountered these real Australian authors before. And I think that's such a terrible thing, really. We should go back and just respect what we had.
Yeah.
Liz?
When I first went to uni, I think there was still more of an emphasis on the British writers,
yes.
and certainly I had to plough my way through the old curiosity shop. With Dickens, there was an awful lot of
lots of Dickens, and
there was lots of Dickens, and there was lots of 19th century British literature, and there wasn't enough Australian literature. My sense, although I don't teach in that area, but my sense is that has changed, that there many universities are now aware of Australian literature as a field of study and are doing what they can to bring it in. But and I would like to think that you're not forced to read the
no one likes to be no one likes to be force-fed what's good for you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we should have a broad knowledge of Australian literature, because sometimes I think there's just wide gaps of knowledge just being missed, and particularly now, I'm sort of particularly worried at this generation, this time that we're all in. High gratification, Instagram, selfies, all very in your face, and it takes and to actually sit down and read a book, it takes several hours, and a lot of people my age and younger just lose interest, and it's very hard to. How would you sort of try and get younger people to read these days? What would you do? I don't know. There should be a public campaign for making reading sexy again somehow, but I think it's very hard because it's constantly competing against all these other far more exciting, sexy options. What can you do? What would you do if you were head of the Make Australian Books Sexy Again campaign? What would you do? Seriously, tell me 3 things you would say. And I'm putting you on your spot now, Ryan. How would you promote Australian literature to young readers?
Well, I mean, things like social media. I mean, that's what young people do, engage with social media. And I think again, there's a lot of Australian writing that is funny and accessible. It isn't dry. Yeah. And obviously, that means the whole Australian literature is a very wide field, but there's certainly stuff that is really funny and engaging. And I don't see any reason why young people wouldn't enjoy it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's to do with marketing. I don't know. We're not promoting Australian writers enough. There's so I don't know. I think Australian engaging in social media, but I can't think of.
I think humour is a really good way in, because the comedy festival is on at the moment. I don't know. I think maybe comedy festivals should think of engaging writers to do like people like you, and God, books can be funny. Read this book; it's funny. Something something
comedians,
like
comedians are writers. They write their own material, and I think there's a lot of overlap. I mean, a joke is essentially a very short story with an unexpected twist at the end. So I think there's definitely overlap there. And I think certainly. My book, I would say that you definitely don't need a PhD in Australian literature to read it and enjoy it. I should make that clear. And it has been written specifically that and it's actually out in the UK later this month, so it's being published in the UK. So it can be, I hope, read and enjoyed, even by someone who doesn't have a great knowledge of Australian literature. If you do have some knowledge of Australian literature, hopefully there'll be echoes and there'll be things you notice in there as well that'll make you laugh. It's certainly, I've sent it to, I know people in England, some reviews are starting to come out in Britain, just from readers, and they're really enjoying it, even though they've got no idea who Henry Lawson is or someone else is, or who these characters might possibly be a satirical take on. So yeah, comedy, going back to your questions, is a great way to explore also serious issues as well. Through comedy, it makes it accessible.
Yeah. Liz, how would you make, Australian books sexy to a younger population who don't necessarily read or read something as short as a text message?
I find it very hard to imagine someone not reading, but maybe that's just showing my age. I think that a great service was probably done to young people with the Harry Potter books. I think, that brought children into reading. And, if we can have a J.K. Rowling, maybe in this audience, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, when I was young, I loved The Magic Pudding and I loved May Gibbs stories, and the richness of Australian children's literature captured me from a very early age. We just need to perhaps have an update of that and someone who can hit the mark with young people now.
Yes.
I think it's a shame that Kath Crowley isn't here tonight because she's the perfect person to...
I'm so sorry she's not here because I would have loved to ask her this question as a YA official on this panel, but yes, we just have to try and make do without it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think all I can say is to everyone in the audience, just read, make sure the young people in your lives have books. Buy books for them for birthdays and try, and even if they don't want to read, take them to a bookstore and say, right, you pick something and get them to read it, because otherwise they're missing out, this generation of non-readers, and that reflects badly on us as a culture. And I think it's such a loss, because I know a lot of people my age and younger who just don't read, and I, as a bibliophile, I am aghast that, you mean you don't read, but they'll binge watch Netflix for days, 4 hours of some series, but the last time I read the book was, I don't know, last year sometime. I think that's incredibly sad. And I don't know how to counter that, but as I say, maybe... Sorry? Oh, well, you try and get a millennial off their phone. I don't know if that's actually possible. I think it's sort of wedded to them. But yes, that would help. No phones, but all I can suggest is, yes, try and get more books into the young people in your lives. Just try and help them read a bit more if you can. Anyway, we are just almost running out of time. I think it's time for QA from the audience. So does anyone have any questions to either of these lovely authors? Yes.
Could you explain what the Prime Minister Awards are, what prizes they provide, and what your process was in winning them? Well,
the Prime Minister's, I don't think either of us are experts on that, really, but, I'm certainly not, but the Prime Minister's Awards are annual awards that have been running for...
10 years.
About 10 years, Yep, that's right. And there are 5 or 6 categories, and the categories have different panels of judges, although in the case of non-fiction history, it's the same panel, at least it was last year for me. Then there's a fiction panel, poetry, children's, young adults. So my publisher put me up for the award, yes. Yes, actually, we've got someone here from the department
can we talk?
And we've got a microphone behind you, yes.
No, my name's Aisha. I work for the Prime Minister's Literary Awards. It has been running for 10 years. We do have 6 categories. And there are 3 panels. We have a panel that judges the children's and the young adult, a panel that does the non-fiction and the history, Australian history, and also the fiction and the poetry. They each have $100,000 in prize money. The winners get $80,000 unless they have a joint winner, which the children's panel did this time. Sorry, the children's category. and 5,000 each for the 4 shortlisted. So there's 5 prizes across each of the categories. And the Prime Minister usually attends the events and awards these categories.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisha.
Yes, another question.
I was just wondering, in line with what you were saying, are they all published books that are in these awards, or are they emerging writers, not published?
Yeah, they would. Working? Yes, so in each year we look at the previous year's publishing, so from January 2016 to December 2016 for the award that our authors actually won. They've all been published authors. I don't remember in the 10 years there being any emergent authors, but yeah. So yes, we look at the previous years. So in the 2017 Prime Minister's Literary Awards, we were looking at books that were published in 2016. So we've just now opened for the 2018 Prime Minister's Literary Awards. We opened, I think, yesterday. And so we'll be looking at books from 2017. You have to be an Australian author, but you don't need to have been published in Australia.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience, please. I think someone at the back there.
With the Prime Minister's Awards, currently self-published authors are disqualified from entering. Will that disqualification be lifted in future?
Okay, sorry.
Now you're getting mean. No. Sorry, we're trying to transition. And right now, non-traditionally published books are accepted. But there are some rules which can rule out self-published books. But we are in a transition period.
Any more questions? Is there someone at the back? Yes.
Yeah. This is a question for Ryan. I loved the book, by the way, but
thank you.
I'd like to know who Rand Washington is based on. As someone who doesn't know very much about Australian literature after being forced to read Henry Lawson at school and being put off for a long time, I'm interested in getting, but is he someone specific or is he a collection?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the small misconceptions about the book is that everyone's based on a real author. Certainly, some of them are. Addison Tiller, one of the characters, is very, very loosely based on Steele Rudd, who is a famous short story writer. But really, most of them are just kind of a play on a type of author. But certainly, Rand Washington, who's a very deeply unpleasant science fiction writer who founds his own religion to extract money from people, is perhaps... there's a very litigious organisation that I probably wouldn't want to offend. So we'll just say it's based on something you might, if you looked around, you might, be something to do with science. You might think about.
I think that's a big clue there.
Yeah, but no, yes. For any libel lawyers out there, it's not actually. No, could we just edit that bit out for the podcast?
Okay, Willa. Okay. Any more questions? Wow, complete silence. Okay, I'm going to bring something across then. So just on a very more general question for you, how do you think Australian books are regarded overseas? How do you think we are seen by just overseas in general?
Well, I was over in Glasgow in January visiting my dad, and I actually made a point of going. I've got several big bookshops in Glasgow, and I actually had a look round to see what Australian fiction was there. And not very much.
Really?
Tim Winton.
How surprising.
Yes, Tim Winton was there.
Peter Carey, was he there?
Peter Carey was there. Tim Winton was there.
Any female authors, Ryan?
There was...
Helen Garner?
No Helen Garner that I could see. There was, in fact, Sarah Schmidt, who recently wrote a novel about Lizzie Borden.
Yep, yes.
That was there, which was great to see. See What I Have Done.
Yep.
But yes, so... I mean, in terms of maybe my UK publisher had one of his. He's deliberately actually looking to Australia because he thinks that lot of great there's a lot of great writing coming out of Australia that isn't being picked up abroad. So his strategy is actually he's watching the shortlists. And that's how he came across my book when it was Mills Frank. He's watching the shortlists to see what comes up, and then he's trying to bring what books he can over through his company and his publisher in Britain. So I think there's certainly hope we'll see if what happens with my books out this month. Hopefully there is an appetite for Australian fiction over there. But yes, certainly just from anecdotal, I didn't see many Australian authors over in the bookshops of Glasgow. Yeah.
It's like, people like Hannah Kent doing really well.
Oh, sorry, Hannah Kent was there. Sorry, that was
very right.
That was still there, and Hannah Kent was a huge international success. So
so every now and then I think we have amazing success with like 1 or 2 titles, but the rest of the time I'm not sure if we make much of a splash overseas. What do you think, Liz? How do you think we're perceived overseas, Australian
I don't
books
really
in
have
general?
a sense of it, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Have either of you travelled recently? Liz, have you travelled recently to even sort of just go and check in these airport bookshops and just to have a check of what Australian books they have on? So
I went to London.
Yes.
And I'll be going back again soon too. But I'll probably watch.
Could you check
more
for us?
closely, Yes, when I go back.
I'm just curious to know now. Yes.
I think it may be a question.
There's a question,
Oh, sorry. There's a question.
Hi, thanks. I've just spent the last 4 years teaching creative writing in the US, so I'm kind of in a position where I've been grappling with this question a lot, and none of the students, teachers or colleagues that I was working with had ever read a word of Australian fiction, which was embarrassing for me, both because I felt very out of place in a program full of engaged readers and writers, that I couldn't kind of bring them to someone because I didn't have the background. So I've spent the last few years grappling with that, and I wondered, as people who think about the future of this country's literature and have spent a long time thinking about its past too, who would you place in people's hands? If you were putting together not necessarily a syllabus, but you want to get people excited about both the past and the present of our country's literature, who do you give to them to read?
Wow.
That is a big question and a very good one, Ryan.
That's a fantastic question. That does.
Christoph Scholkes.
Christoph Scholkes is extremely a writer that grabs readers. There's so many to choose from. Certainly,
5. Name 5.
Okay, I would say in terms of modern writers, I would say Julie Coe. A short story writer, and very odd, weird, and very funny short stories, which would really engage the reader, I believe. I think Henry Lawson, to represent the past. He's a weirdly underrated writer. I think he's taken for granted. I think there's an enormous skill in Lawson. That is maybe a bit taken for granted because his stories are generally set in the bush and things like that. But he's an enormously skillful writer. In fact, my next book, for a little plug, is called The Drover's Wives, where I've taken Henry Lawson's short story and rewritten it in 99 different ways. So that's my contribution to trying to get people engaged with.
So your imagination just spins me out, Ryan.
So Lawson, Coe. Helen Garner, obviously.
Yes.
Who else?
I'd probably put a plug in for George Meredith and from another era,
yes.
but My Brother Jack was one of the books that really engaged me when I was very young. Yeah.
Barbara Bainton, who I mentioned earlier, and perhaps to finish off, my recommendations would be who I consider to be the greatest living Australian writer, Frank Moorhouse. And his short stories and his Edith trilogy. So that's, very much off the top of my head, but there's just, I was actually paralysed because there was so many names popping into my head. So the great thing is, it's not like there's a scarcity of great writing, it is out there, but it's a matter of for whatever reason, getting Australians to read Australian novels. That's what we need to do, not just Scottish people.
Great opportunity if you could do that, to actually put together a syllabus like that. I think you could have a great time.
There are so many Australian authors. I find it hard to even come up with just 10 or something. We have such a huge selection there to choose from.
I was in the one thing I noticed. It's a similarity between Australia and Scotland. In the bookshops in Scotland, you've got fiction, then you've got Scottish fiction. In the bookshops in Australia, you've got fiction and you've got Australian fiction. Now, when you go to England, there's no section for English fiction. because they don't feel that kind of, oh, we need to separate, it's a special thing. And I think that is, fantastic that Dymocks does have a massive Australian literature section, that's great, but I don't see why we have to differ, because it's fiction, it's all words, it's good, it should, I think I would put it almost all together and stop, because I think people are more, perhaps, if they see that Australian literature section, they might just do a U-turn and head for the general fiction, so get it all in the general fiction. You find the book you read, you don't know if it's Australian or whoever, and go for that. I just find that interesting. It might go back to that cultural cringe of, there's a Scottish fiction and an Australian fiction. There is no English fiction in England. They've just got, fiction.
Yep,
Yeah.
I agree. I just want to put in a plug in the two authors I mentioned earlier, people like Alice Pung and Maxine Benebert Clark. They're younger, they're more, they represent a diverse, multicultural Australia that is so important to showcase, because this is who we are and this is who we will be. And it's not all just about white, Caucasian background authors. I know lots of amazing people of colour authors who are finally getting some traction in their careers, because publishing houses are finally opening up and realising there are stories to be told that haven't yet been told. And really, about time is all I can say. Finally, we're sort of catching up. I think we have room for probably one small question. Anyone? Yes.
Hi, I'm an English teacher as well, so
yes, great.
I'm sure I'm probably not one of the only teachers in the room, but I just had a question. What advice would you give to a young person who wanted to be a writer that maybe I could take back and share with the students I teach?
Liz.
Well, you've got to write all the time, really, and you've got to keep a journal. And I find, I don't want to be too prescriptive because this works for me and it might not work for other people, but I've, from the earliest age, written a journal, kept a record of my thoughts, and including my reading and my thoughts about the reading. And I write little essays and, something... because of the influence of Clive James, I think, who was very much an essayist, whenever there was something that interested me, or perhaps a difficult problem or conundrum or something I was dealing with, I would write about it. Just small little pieces. I've still got a lot of them going way back. So I think if you're going to be a writer, you have to write all the time, but you also have to, of course, read voraciously and eclectically, across all the genres, I think. Mm-hmm. I love poetry too. I absolutely adore Kenneth Slessor, the great Australian poet. Mm. And I used to carry my book of poetry wherever I went and read it. So it's not rocket science. Mm-hmm. It's just being open to the world of literature, the world of ideas, and being willing to engage with it. Because as I say to my students, I teach writing, that writing is actually part of thinking. And you think through problems and conundrums and ideas by writing about them. So that's the message I convey to my students, and hopefully it works.
Great, thanks Liz. Ryan?
I think writing advice can be tricky. In fact, in an upcoming issue of The Monthly, the magazine, I've got a little, I've done a little sheet of writing advice and that I found through research, and literally I've got writing advice from 10 famous authors on one side of the page and writing advice from 10 on the other side of the page, and they directly contradict each other each time. Yeah. Literally someone, write every day. Stephen King, don't write every day. Yes. Alice Munro, something like that. So, but I think for me, the one thing I would say is, read. You've got. I think that's, for me, that's the actual. That's the one cast iron rule. You cannot be a writer unless you read. And the only other rule is don't give up. I know of many of my friends when I was at school who were actually better writers than me, creative writers, and only one of them is now literally, he's literally a merchant banker who's on millions a year in Hong Kong, so maybe he actually did make the right decision, come to think of it. But
yes, but does he have a tractor?
Yeah, he doesn't have a tractor. So I think, just don't give up. If you want, you can't give up. I got rejected a lot. Literally, I have a short story writer, you get rejected a lot. I've easily notched up over 200 rejections. I just don't give up. So read. Don't give up. Write when you can. If it's every day, that's great. If it's once a month, that's great. If it's 10 minutes every 4 days, whatever works for you, read and write, I think, and don't give up.
Thank you, Ryan. I think that's a good note to end this forum. So read, write and be resilient. Thank you. Can we please have a collective hand for Ryan O'Neill and Elizabeth Tynan?
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.